During my coverage of the November 10th Apple event, I saw two very different takes emerging in the chat. On the one hand, you had people going, holy cow, this kind of performance and battery life and optimization, and that's just the first step for Apple Silicon. This is really promising, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. And then the other crowd was going, really? That's it? They didn't change the designs at all? They didn't even put in a 1080p webcam? Seriously? This is your whole big new generation thing? It's barely any different. So those two sentiments would seem to be diametrically opposed, but I think they're both accurate. So in today's video, we are going to break down what the new launch of Apple Silicon actually means. Is it worth buying? And if so, which one should you buy? So before we get started today, it goes without saying that I'm going to have reviews and coverage of all of these Macs. I bought all three, the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini. Never mind that they all basically have the same specs, so I kind of bought three different versions of the same computer. But anyway, of the new Mac Mini, MacBook Air, and MacBook Pro, there are two main things that I want to address with this video. Number one, should you upgrade to them? Number two, if you should, which one should you buy? So first things first, this is my 2020 base model 13-inch MacBook Pro with two Thunderbolt 3 ports. Now, if you have one of these, if you bought it back in, May, I think, and I recommended buying them. I said, yes, it's a great computer. It's not particularly exciting, but it's great. Buy it. So if you did, if you bought it back then, or even more recently, like over the summer, you might be going, I shouldn't have done that. I should have waited, and I should have bought the Apple Silicon version. And that's as maybe, but don't necessarily feel that guilty. Don't go out there like, okay, well, I'm going to sell it. I'm going to take a $300 hit on the value of that 4-month-old computer just so I can buy the new Apple Silicon version. I wouldn't do that. See, the thing is, these new Apple Silicon Macs are not necessarily revolutionary. As we've been talking about for a while, Apple is less into revolution and more into evolution. So that's why you see these new Apple Silicon Macs where they haven't changed a single thing about the design. So don't necessarily be swayed by the fact that this is the first of a generation. The first isn't always the best. I mean, all you have to do is think back to the first MacBook Pro. It came out in early 2006. And within that same year, there was a late 2006 model that had Core 2 Duos compared to Core Duos. It had 64-bit support, it was a lot faster, it got supported for a lot longer. And then 2 years later, the Unibody MacBook Pro came out. That was long regarded as one of the best MacBooks that has ever existed. So just because these are the first crop of Macs to use Apple Silicon doesn't necessarily mean that all of your Intel stuff is worthless and you should go out and buy one right away because this is the best one and it's going to last you for a million years. That being said, the inverse is also true, and you shouldn't wait on these MacBooks just because the design hasn't changed. I mean, think of it this way. If you look at the base model MacBook Air, the price is the same, the RAM is the same, the storage is the same, the design is the same, but you're getting way more power, way better battery life, and insane optimization. You're also getting a P3 color gamut screen if that matters. Those things alone make it an objectively better value than the previous 2020 MacBook Air that came out like a couple of months ago. So as ever with Apple, there are trade-offs. You know, we all wish that Apple would just come out with the one computer that was amazing and perfect, but then everyone would just buy that computer and they'd never have to do anything again. So obviously, it's not going to happen. If there's one really objectively wonderful thing to happen with these new Apple Silicon Macs, it's the fact that the low-end Macs are good again. For the longest time, the MacBook Air was such an underwhelming product. Even the 2020 version, which was like okay, and they added the quad-core processors, which was nice. But, you know, in the base configuration, it was just slow. I mean, it was never really designed to be a powerful computer, but it couldn't be powerful even if you wanted it to. Now, with Apple Silicon, even the low-end stuff could be really, really powerful. It's at the point here where you have to wonder to yourself, why would I spend the extra $300 to jump from the Air to the Pro? Well, to find out, I think we need to jump in the comparison tool on Apple's website and see what exactly you get with the 3 different configurations of essentially the same computer. I say the same computer because if you look down here, there's not a ton of differences. They all have the 8-core Apple M1, they all have 8 or 16 gigabytes of RAM, they all have up to 2 terabytes of storage, and they all start with 256. So internally, these are basically the same computer. Except for the base model MacBook Air, which has the 7-core GPU, whereas the other ones all have the 8-core GPU. But apart from that, they're basically the same. At least on paper, that is, because you have to keep in mind that the MacBook Air is passively cooled with just a heatsink, whereas the MacBook Pro has a fan, and the Mac Mini has a larger fan. So, in theory, and by the way, we can't say this definitively, in theory, the MacBook Air should be a little less powerful than the MacBook Pro, which could be a little bit less powerful than the Mac Mini. Take that with a grain of salt because we're going to have to do some testing to figure out whether that's actually the case, but at the very least, the MacBook Air is no longer completely neutered with a dual-core i3 in the base configuration. Now, between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, there are a number of differences. You get, for example, better battery life with the MacBook Pro, which makes sense because you have, well, a larger battery. You also get the Touch Bar as well as Touch ID, whereas with the Air, you just get Touch ID and you have to deal with function keys. Or perhaps that's a benefit, I don't know. 720p FaceTime camera. Oh God, it's 2020. Why is that still here? Uh-oh, wait a minute. I found another difference here, folks. If you look at the MacBook Pro, it has a studio quality 3-mic array, not just a 3-mic array. That's worth it. They all have Wi-Fi 6, they all have Bluetooth 5, they all have 2 Thunderbolt ports because for some reason you can't get Apple Silicon in the 4 Thunderbolt port MacBook Pro. I don't know. So basically, 3 different shapes of the same computer at 3 different price points. Now, looking at this a little further, I think the Mac Mini might be basically a sleeper. At $699, once we find out how this thing performs, that might not just be a good deal for a Mac, but for any desktop, really. I mean, you look at an HTPC, a lot of those have U-series Core i5s, and this has about as much power draw as one of those, but could be incredibly powerful. I mean, in Apple's keynote, they compared it to what I assume was the previous base model Mac Mini, the Core i3-8100, and it was substantially more powerful than that, which means that we could be competing with the likes of, say, a Core i5-10600, which is basically what you would find in the $1,800 iMac, and this is $699. And I think the same will be true for the MacBook Air. I mean, we could be talking about a $1,000 Ultrabook with desktop processor performance. And that brings me to one of the most interesting dilemmas. If the MacBook Air is now so good, why would you buy the MacBook Pro? I mean, look at this base model configuration. The only thing that you're getting for your extra $300 compared to the MacBook Air is 1 GPU core and better battery life, as well as the Touch Bar and I guess a slightly brighter display and a fan. And granted, we don't know exactly what the performance difference will be between those two. They have the same chip, but not the same thermal architecture, so it's possible that the MacBook Pro could be noticeably more powerful, but I'm not sure if it's going to be $300 more powerful. And I mean, if you want to talk about bad deals, all you have to do is scroll down a little bit on this webpage, because the Intel MacBook Pros, I think, are a complete and utter waste of time. I mean, sure, you get 16 gigabytes of RAM and you can upgrade that to 32, but 10th generation Core i5 is most certainly going to be outperformed by the Apple Silicon, and it's more expensive. So I think this is really a niche product for people who absolutely cannot exist for whatever reason on Apple Silicon. Now, obviously on this channel, I'm going to be doing a ton of benchmarking and comparison to figure out not just how the M1 chip compares to other Intel and AMD chips, but also how it compares in these 3 different implementations. But it's worth noting that performance and benchmarks are, in this case, I think a relative term, because really what's going to be important here is optimization. Apple has always been known for optimizing their hardware and their software incredibly closely. That's why you get something like an iPhone 12 Pro that has way less RAM than other flagships, but performs just as well, if not better. So there's reason to believe that with these new Apple Silicon Macs, even if the performance puts it at a certain level, it could exceed that in terms of actual usability just because of how tightly knit the macOS operating system is with the capabilities of these chips. And that's especially going to be true in apps like Final Cut Pro. That is something that is already incredibly well optimized to the Mac hardware that we've had on Intel for quite some time. But now with an Apple Silicon version, you can expect that to be cranked up to 11. Now, I know that there's not a lot of people that are thinking about this right now, but I did see a surprising number of tweets and YouTube comments essentially asking, should I sell my 16-inch MacBook Pro and get the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 chip? No, absolutely not. This is the first step in a new generation. That means there's going to be other steps coming in the future, which means, obviously, a 16-inch MacBook Pro with Apple Silicon. So if you're running even a 15-inch MacBook Pro from like 2017 or 2018 and you're eyeing this new 13-inch Apple Silicon going, oh, maybe I should just buy that, I think it would still be smart to, at the very least, wait for reviews. Because, I mean, you can't make up your mind without knowing what the product is actually going to be like, now more than ever with a completely brand new platform. But more importantly, the 13-inch isn't gonna be the be-all end-all for Apple Silicon. There's going to be a 16-inch later, there's going to be desktops and a Mac Pro eventually, so don't necessarily jump on the first thing that comes out. So I guess my overarching advice for the first round of Apple Silicon is patience. It's here, we've been waiting for it, we're really excited, and I'm personally overjoyed to be able to test all 3 of these for you guys. However, that doesn't mean that you need to go out right away and buy it straight off the bat. This is the first step of many. There's going to be plenty of time for you to make up your mind on Apple Silicon. And I think now more than ever, it's important to wait for the reviews. Not just mine, although obviously I would encourage you to stay subscribed and watch my coverage of these things, but you're gonna want to get an idea of what this completely new, different system is going to mean for you. So with that, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what your thoughts on Apple Silicon are in the comments below. And while you're down there, you might as well check the description, which is just a little bit above the comments, and go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Luke Miani, follow my Twitch channel and my subreddit. And with that, I will see you guys in the next video.